Hi folks, how are you doing? My name is Danny and I am alcoholic. I'm going to share my experience and knowledge on what in recovery circles we call the spiritual malady. Now for some, the spiritual malady has some mysterious, perhaps spooky qualities, but there's nothing peculiar about it. There's no need to concern ourselves. But today I'm going to describe what the spiritual malady is and perhaps more importantly what the solution to it is. And while I'm doing that, I'm going to share what I believe is the whole purpose of recovery, because it's all tied together. I'm going to begin with my favourite sentence in the book Alcoholics Anonymous, found on page 132. We have recovered and have been given the power to help others. Here is the promise of recovery and of course the purpose too. We are given the power to live free from this illness in order that we dedicate our lives, our purpose, our meaning to helping others. That is the whole deal of this. That's what it's all about. Recovery is not simply about abstinence. This is a constant theme throughout the book Alcoholics Anonymous. As it says, it is unthinking to say that sobriety is enough. More than that, I'd say it's kind of selfish. There is a long period of reconstruction ahead in recovery, and our job is to take the lead there in our lives and in our world. At its core, the illness of alcoholism is about selfishness and self-centeredness, and that essentially is the spiritual malady at its most basic level. Recovery can be measured by how considerate we have become of others, really. They say there's no rules in recovery, but that's just to quote a one-word sentence, nonsense. Here is one on page 74, for instance. The rule is that we must be hard on ourselves, but always considerate of others. To quote page 19, we feel that elimination of our drinking is but a beginning. A much more important demonstration of our principles lies before us in our respective homes, occupations and affairs. It's about how we live our lives. This is not a selfish program. Nothing could be further from the truth. It's a deeply selfish illness though. As I say, selfishness, self-centeredness is the core. It is the root of the malady, this spiritual malady that is often talked about, but so often misunderstood. Now the word selfish is one of those words that's often misunderstood, by the way. It's not that a person should not care about themselves. Quite the opposite, actually. If a person does not take care of their basic needs, then someone else has to. So if you don't, that's being selfish, actually. But to be selfish is to live without any thought or consideration for others. And as I've already said, the most basic principle of recovery is to develop consideration for others. There is no place for selfishness in recovery. Now I've been around the recovery rooms for nearly 19 years now. I've been sober for over 17 of those years, and I would say that I've been aware that I had recovered maybe 16 and a half years now. And I'm sure we've all heard things that have bothered us over the years. For me though, there is one seemingly senseless argument that has troubled me the most. The argument is about whether the illness of alcoholism is twofold or threefold, whether it's a twofold or threefold illness. No doubt some of you that might end up listening to this will have very strong opinions about this. So I wonder, what do you believe? Before I continue, what do you believe right now? Is it a twofold or a threefold illness as people describe it? Well, I will address this as I explore what the spiritual malady is. When in connection to the illness alcoholism, what the spiritual malady is in connection to the illness that we call alcoholism. Spend a bit of time explaining that. From the beginning of the book Alcoholics Anonymous, through the doctor's opinion in the next 3 chapters, a description of what makes an alcoholic different from a non-alcoholic is described. It describes how they are bodily and mentally different. Chapter 3, more about alcoholism, begins with the following lines. Most of us have been unwilling to admit we were real alcoholics. No person likes to think he is bodily and mentally different from his fellows. It talks about how we learned that we had to fully concede to our innermost selves that we were alcoholic, how we were bodily and mentally different from non-alcoholic people. The book itself spends a great deal of time explaining how we are physically different as well as how we are mentally different. That once an alcoholic puts any alcohol into their system, that it sets off an abnormal reaction, a craving for more. That's the physical. And that when an alcoholic is stone cold sober, suddenly this overpowering thought will occur that compels us to take the first drink. How we're mentally different. And sometimes we do this with little or no thought, or sometimes, and I experienced this, you just find yourself in the middle of a relapse, what I personally will call a sober blackout, or what is referred to in the book on page 42 as a strange mental blank spot. When you suddenly find yourself drinking and you can't even remember taking the first one. That happened to me on more than one occasion, I can assure you, when trying to be sober. With all my strength and all my heart and all my mind. So what is it that causes this insanity? What compels people to take the poison after a period of abstinence when their lives have returned to some sense of seeming normality? Why do people relapse after a few months or even a few years of sobriety? Why does an alcoholic commit the insane act of taking the first drink? Or if they don't even do that, why do they find it impossible to live in the world, falling into a deep depression or worse case scenario, find they cannot live with it or live without it, and suicide seems the only option? The only solution to getting out of the hell is to take your own life. Why do so many do this? We lost a brother to suicide just over 3 years ago now. He was an addict, and the family have never recovered from the loss, not really, not completely. I personally will never forget the look on the face of the coroner, the tears actually in his eyes as he described exactly how he took his life, and in detail. And he talked about the obvious love and support he had been given from so many. Love could not stop him, as in his mind the only way out of the agony was to take his own life. He couldn't live with it, and he couldn't live without it. The supreme sacrifice seemed the only option. So what causes the insanity of relapse, or worse than relapse? Something must. What is this third aspect? Well, some call it the missing piece of step 1. Some call it the third fold of the illness. In the book Alcoholics Anonymous, on page 64, it is simply referred to as the spiritual malady. So an alcoholic is bodily and mentally different from non-alcoholic people. And this leads to some saying that this illness is twofold. That said, there is a third aspect too, that if left untreated leads to the mental aspect being activated, which leads to the first drink, which activates the spiritual aspect. So this leads to some saying that the illness is threefold. So, which one is it? Well, I'm going to explain now why I've come to believe that it's actually the problem lies in the phrases twofold or threefold illness. They're just unhelpful, and worse than that, actually, it's quite divisive language. As I've already stated, it leads to senseless arguments in the room, and worse than that, it confuses the chuffing heck, if you like. It confuses newcomers. Confuses people who've been around a long time, actually. My suggestion is to stop using either phrase, because they're both kind of right and they're both kind of wrong. An alcoholic is bodily and mentally different. That is true. But there is also no doubt that we suffer from a spiritual malady. And in actual fact, the solution described in the book tells us how we recover from the spiritual malady, which then straightens out the alcoholic mentally and physically. But the spiritual malady does not make us different from non-alcoholics. The truth is, to some degree or other, every person on earth suffers or has suffered from the spiritual malady. Just look at the world, man. Look at your own families, the people around you. No, to some degree or other, everyone has the spiritual malady. The difference is for an alcoholic, and certainly one like me, is that I can't live in the malady. I certainly couldn't remain sober like that. So the difference seems to be that non-alcoholic people don't seemingly die from what they turn to in order to live in that sense of emptiness that comes with the spiritual malady. I can think of my brother, my full brother, the closest one to me, for example. He's certainly bodily and mentally different when it comes to alcohol to alcoholic people. He has a very different reaction. He kind of has an abnormal reaction to it, actually, the opposite of mine though, because it makes him really ill. It makes him ill for a week if he was to touch alcohol, so he never drinks it. He hasn't done for 20 odd years, in fact, despite the fact that for so many years of his life he travelled all over the world as a musician. He just played. That's how he treated his malady, obsessed around his music, I think, and other things in life. But I remember when we were kids, he could argue that if you looked at us two as children, that out of the pair of us, he seemingly suffered more from this malady than I did. We grew up in the same household, not a great place really. Pretty frightening, if I'm honest. And he found ways to go into himself, I suppose. We both found different ways to go into ourselves, to protect ourselves, to survive actually. For him it was obsessively playing music and all kinds of other things that he got into. I found more destructive ways to get by. And mine, of course, almost killed me, whereas his gave him a life. That said, throughout his life he's gone to some pretty dark places. Why? Because he still suffers from this underlying human spiritual malady. And as I've already said, everybody on earth does to some degree. Some less than others, but to some degree. So like I've said, the problem's in the phrase twofold or threefold illness. You know, I did a word search in the book a few years ago. Do you know what? You will not find either phrase in there. The word fold, you can't even find the word fold in the whole of the book. Not even once. The book talks about being bodily and mentally different, which I know is what folk mean when they say it's a twofold illness. But it also talks about a spiritual malady, which is the core of everything, core of it all. Oh, and by the way, while we're on the subject of language and language that's used and not used, you will only find the word disease once in the entirety of the whole book, and that is on page 64 when it describes the common manifestations of self. Big hint there, by the way, that's kind of what we mean by the spiritual malady, but more about that later. Here's the full quote. Resentment is the number one offender. It destroys more alcoholics than anything else. From it stem all forms of spiritual disease. For we have been not only mentally and physically ill, we have been spiritually sick. When the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. Now when it states resentment is the number one offender, it means that resentment is the number one common, the most common, if you like, manifestation of self. Hint, hint, of the spiritual malady. Alcoholics are bodily and mentally different. but they also have a spiritual malady. But the spiritual malady is not unique to the alcoholic. So, let's give up on this senseless argument about it being a 2- or 3-fold illness. The solution treats the spiritual malady, and in so doing, it means that we do not then suffer from what makes us different from non-alcoholic people, which is the mind and the body. I hope that's helpful. It makes sense to me, but I'm sure that some folk will carry on using the phraseology that they use, even though it's quite divisive really and doesn't quite make sense. It's a simple message this, so let's keep it that way really. Let's not confuse the Homeriac out of people. Now, I'm going to talk now a little bit about what we mean when we say our lives have become unmanageable. The bit, if you like, after the dash in step 1 on the wall. Often unmanageability is seen as a consequence of alcoholism. The mess our lives get in, and by goodness, our lives, mine certainly was, becomes a mess. They think it's about all the crazy things that happen as a consequence of drinking alcohol. But this, though, is not really the unmanageability that we who have recovered are talking about. Not really. This is not really the insanity that's being described or the unmanageability of our lives when we talk about the illness alcoholism. What's really being described is an inward unmanageability, really, rather than an outward one, which are consequences of drinking alcohol, to the way that we drink it. It's what Dr. Silkworth, in the Doctor's Opinion, describes as being restless, irritable, and discontent. For me, it's just this feeling of just not being right in my own skin, this sense of not really belonging anywhere with anyone, this terror of being alone, and yet this being overwhelmed when in the company of others. And it got worse when those early weeks and months of being dry. Not feeling that I even belonged in the rooms, feeling that fundamentally there was something fundamentally wrong with me at the core of my being, that I was just wrong at the core of myself, that there was something fundamentally wrong with my humanity. Now, I've heard many terms over the years for what is described as this inward unmanageability. Some will call it untreated alcoholism. Some, of course, point to those bedevilments as they're described on page 52. I'll read them here. We were having trouble with personal relationships. We couldn't control our emotional natures. We were a prey to misery and depression. We couldn't make a living. We had a feeling of uselessness. We were full of fear. We were unhappy. We couldn't seem to be of real help to other people. On page 64, though, they just simply call it the spiritual malady. But you get those feelings, and those feelings are what I lived with, drunk or sober, without having had the spiritual experience, spiritual awakening. Being free from alcohol, physically and even mentally, does not treat the spiritual malady. I became painfully aware of this in the weeks leading up to my first physical sobriety birthday. I had worked through the steps. I was fully engaged in several fellowships actually at the time. I was doing service all over the place. I had reconstructed my life. I was working. I'd got a load of money in for a project, and yet I just could not live. I'd made a good beginning on recovery, but I hadn't continued to grow. I couldn't face life. I couldn't work. I walked away actually from my work, from my career. I gave it up. 11 months sober. I just couldn't face it. I just did not have the strength. I was deeply depressed. I could not sleep. My mind was racing. I hated everybody in the rooms. Number 1 on my list was my sponsor. I could not sleep. I was gripped by insomnia. The worst part of my day was when I put my head on my pillow. and I closed my eyes, because this is when the tornado of my mind would begin. My world shrank to nothing. I lost my career, and I wanted to die. I have never felt more alone in my life. The obsession returned. I found myself ranting in meetings. Thank God there was no social media around at the time, as I dread to think what insanity I would have posted on things in those days. I came as close to relapse as you can come without drinking. My mind was completely shut off to any kind of spiritual concepts. And I let the folks in the rooms know about it. Thank goodness for patience, kindliness, tolerance and love, because it was always shown to me in those ranting days. Those dark, dark days. How dark it is before the dawn, they say. Yeah. And this was 11 months without alcohol in my system, having gone through the work, as they call it, but not continuing, and my mind had closed. I was broken. I had been beaten, as they say, into a state of reasonableness, but not by drugs or alcohol, by life, by my inability to live in the world as I truly was. I could not live purely from my own resources. I could not manage my own life. I needed help, and I hit this deeper second rock bottom. I stopped fighting. I stopped wrestling. My hip, if you like to use that great mythos story, dislocated, and I quit fighting. I surrendered to a deeper, deeper level, and I asked another man, to help me. Now I was ready to go to any lengths. When I first came to the rooms, I had had enough of drinking, but the illness had not had enough of me. So after a year of relapsing, I was then ready to take certain steps. But now I was willing to go to any lengths. I was ready to stop negotiating with this malady. I was ready, willing and able to accept a spiritual solution, to lay aside my prejudices to the spiritual concepts. I accepted that not only was I powerless, but that I could not manage my own life. More than that though, that I truly was beyond human aid. I was beyond the aid of my own aid, or anybody else's aid really. So I asked a man to help me, a man who had stood up and abused in a meeting only weeks before, and he showed me the way. He didn't help me in the sense that he didn't do it for me, didn't give me the power, but he showed me the way with patience, kindness, tolerance and love. But he told me the truth, and he just guided me. He shared his experience and his knowledge with me. The rest was up to me really. When I look back now, I can almost feel it really, intensely, the restlessness, the irritability and the discontentment as it just coursed through my body and my mind, just there under the skin, but deeper sometimes in the marrow of my being. Just this uncomfortable feel. Well, uncomfortable is not the word, but just this prickly feeling all the time, just not feeling right in my own skin. I could not form any kind of personal relationship with anybody really. I couldn't let anyone near me or dare get near to anyone else really. If I did, I seemed to get consumed by them, or I would allow them to consume me. My emotional nature was out of control. My emotions would go from deep depression to rage to uncontrollable tears to hysterical laughter. I was utterly miserable, and I was deeply depressed at that time before I asked this man to help. Antidepressants did not fix it. I couldn't make a living. Like I said, I walked away from my career just before my first sobriety birthday. I just couldn't face it anymore. I felt utterly useless. I felt worthless. I felt pointless. I felt I should not exist. And I found insane reasons for this due to things about my dad, really, and all kinds of other nonsense. I was terrified of everything. I would flinch if people were physically close, and I displayed deep paranoia about everything. I was miserably unhappy. I felt like a hindrance to everyone. I was of no help to anybody, especially people in the rooms. I would just dominate them, just like an emotional vampire, if you like. The idea of sponsoring someone else or even helping someone else just seemed way beyond me. And yet at other times I could put on the act. Just depended whose company I was in, really. I've been an expert at this all of my life. That line on page 60 to 61 describes me nearly perfectly. The actor who wants to run the whole show. I was a bit like that in the meetings I did service in, and I've just been like that all my life. Sometimes I was like that in obvious ways you take, but other times I was much more subtle about it, really. From a very, very, very young age, probably even 3 years old, I learnt to control the potential anger of others towards me. I could see danger. I needed to as a little boy due to fear of violence. I'd become very, very successful at self-protection from a very, very young age. But this meant that no one ever saw the real me. All my life, my whole being had been driven by what they say is 100, maybe 1,000 forms of fear. I lived in terror that anyone would see the real me, for the real me, in my eyes, was disgusting. I was driven by this deep self-delusion, which led me to constantly seek from others, of course, and I was an expert in gaining pity from the world. I lived from my own will, this powerful instinct just to stay alive, a fury to do so, really. And yet, even though I was driven by this desire to live, to protect myself in life, at the same time I was obsessed with finding a way to die without anybody thinking I'd taken my own life. I had this weird self-obsessional guilt, a guilt though that kept me alive, thank goodness. I lived purely from self while using others to give to myself. Self will run riot, if you like. They say leading a double life. Well, I was a chuffing chameleon. And sadly, so many other people got caught up in the maelstrom, the storm, the tornado, so much so that my life was reduced to nothing. The annihilation of everything worthwhile in life, reduced to nil, to nothing of any value at all. Life meant nothing. It was going nowhere, meant nothing and leads to nothing. Avoid everything, avoid everything, avoid everything was my mantra, because everything is bad for you. It's a line from a song, The Power of Lard by Lard, and that meant something to me, because life is just bad. Nasty, brutish and short, to quote Thomas Hobbes. You live in a state of fear, a state of war. I was empty, I was utterly alone, and yet surrounded by folk, really. Nothing touched me at all. Something was missing. These are the symptoms of the spiritual malady as I experienced them anyway. It had a total grip on me at 11 months sober, seemingly worse than I was in active alcoholism. It may not have actually been worse, it was just that I was more awake and aware of it, and my nervous system was no longer numbed by alcohol. It was physically alive again, so I was feeling things more intensely. I felt completely alone, and I couldn't have gone on like that for much longer. If I had, I don't think I'd be here today. So thank God I broke. Thank God I surrendered unconditionally. Thank God I asked for help and someone took the time to share their experience and knowledge with me and show me the way. You know what? I changed quickly. I changed so quickly, and as a result I connected to something I could not have believed in before. All I did was set aside my prejudice though. I was willing to search, and I was willing to search in the one place I had never searched before, deep, deep down within myself. And of course, if you think about it, that's the last place a person's going to look if they believe that they are the most disgusting piece of dog shit who bizarrely lived right in the centre of the universe. You know, step 2 for me was simply that I don't know, but I am willing to give this an honest go. And that was more than enough, you know, to get through step 2. I don't know, but I'll give it an honest go. That was step 2 for me. I didn't believe in anything really, but I lay aside my prejudice. I saw the truth of the 3 pertinent ideas. Here they are. A description of the alcoholic, the chapter 2, the agnostic, and our personal adventures before and after make clear 3 pertinent ideas. A, that we were alcoholic and could not manage our own lives. B, that probably no human power could have relieved our alcoholism. C, that God could and would if he was sought. Well, you know what? I was willing to seek. In my case, actually, it wasn't alcohol so much as unmanageability that had been the great persuader. It was that had finally beaten me into this strange state of reasonableness. You know what I mean though, don't you? As I keep saying, if I had not asked that man for help that day, God only knows what would have happened to me. I may not be here today. What I do know is that at this point my life was not my own. I could see I needed to find something new by which I could live. A new manager, if you like. Not this man, obviously, but what this man knew. What he knew was that even someone like me, as disgusting a creature as I saw myself, that even someone like me could gain access to this power. Even someone like me. I believe many things in my life that were complete nonsense, completely wrong, and one of them was that I was this disgusting, despicable thing that should not live. I believed that for many, many years. Didn't question that. How wrong I was. Thank God I changed my mind. Or my mind changed. And I couldn't overcome it just by my own wit and will. You see, the spiritual malady is simply this idea that we can do it ourselves, that we can manage everything ourselves. What page 62 describes as selfishness and self-centeredness, that we think is the root of our troubles. And of course, the solution to that is to let our roots grasp a new soil, to live from another place other than self, to live by a power greater than ourselves. Why? Because we cannot defeat self with self. Pretty logical if you think about it. It's not, none of this is complicated. It's pretty simple stuff. But we don't have to go anywhere to find it. The great paradox is you don't need to go anywhere to find this power. All you got to do, all I had to do, was engage in that spiritual journey of depth. It's not a journey of distance. It's there within you. You don't need to go anywhere. You just need to take the hardest journey of them all. The spiritual journey is a journey of 1 inch, to quote Meister Eckhart. Very arduous. It's where you learn to find yourself, feel at home at the ground beneath your feet. It's a journey of depth, not distance. The road of happy destiny doesn't go anywhere. The journey itself, it's a road to nowhere. You don't go anywhere. That's the beauty of this stuff. You don't need to. It's already in you. Back to the spiritual malady, this concept of self. To quote page 62. So our troubles, we think, are basically of our own making. They arise out of ourselves, and the alcoholic is an extreme example of self-will run riot, though he usually doesn't think so. By the way, we're not the only example, remember that. Above everything, nothing is more important than this. Above everything, we alcoholics must be rid of this selfishness. We must, or it kills us. God makes that possible. And there often seems no way of entirely getting rid of self without his aid. Many of us had moral and philosophical convictions galore, but we could not live up to them even though we would have liked to. Neither could we reduce our self-centeredness much by wishing or trying on our own power. We had to have God's help. You know what the first thing you need to do in order to begin to form the relationship with the power, to live by that power? The first thing you have to do is to quit playing God. We kind of live under new management. We're planted in new soil. God directing, giving us the power, and we living by the power, playing our role fully in life. What we need to do is to let God live in and through us. Not ask God what we want God to do, but ask God what God wants us to do. And of course, to access the power, to go live by the power. Go and do what we're here to do. Go live that life. Step 3 is not some passive act where we, as so many people say, we hand it over to God and expect God to sort it out for us, if you like. I expect it all to get sorted out for us. And because if you think about that logically, that would be kind of asking God to do our will for us. Go on, God, hand it over to you. You sort it out. It's not what this is about. God offers what we lack, strength and direction. It's an illness of powerlessness and unmanageability. So we need strength and direction. Logical, isn't it? But the action is always ours. Always. I do God's will, not the other way around. God is the director, but it's up to us to play our role. When I look at my life, I did as much, if not more, damage by not doing what I was meant to be doing than by actually imposing my will on others. That's how I played God, by rejecting and refusing to do what I'm here to do, by walking away, by turning away. I played God by not participating in life, by refusing to engage, by running away, by not living this life I had been given. Freely given. Life is the greatest gift of them all, and I didn't want it. So what do? We turn down the other path. We turn to God because living from self has failed utterly. And of course, if you want to develop a conscious relationship with God, the first thing anybody has to do is to quit playing God. Your roots grasp a new soil, so you're no longer living from self, which is the root of our troubles. You are no longer ruled by the spiritual malady. And as we do, we begin to become conscious of his presence. We are reborn here. It's a kind of rebirth. It's a new beginning. It's a new start. It's a, to use religious language, a conversion experience, if you like. But it's only the beginning. It's the start. It's not the end. And interestingly, this is interesting to me at least, the word conversion comes from the Latin word convertere, which meant to turn or to return. Isn't that what we're doing in step 3? We turn our will and our lives. We stand at the turning point, just before the steps. I think page 60 or 59, I can't remember. Anyway, we stood at the maybe 58. We stood at the turning point, the hinge of it all. So we thus begin the process of recovery as we begin to take the action that will relieve us of the spiritual malady. Remember, the real alcoholic is given two options: an alcoholic death or a spiritual way of life. We need to make the decision. What is our choice to be? It's the only choice we get, you know. And that's the decision we make in step 3. Why? We decide, we turn down the spiritual way of life because we don't want the hideous, usually slow death of alcoholism. But it's just a beginning. It's just a start. You have to continue. You have to grow. I didn't the first time round, and as the result, I got really ill sober. To illustrate, I'm just going to share my own experience around this stuff because it might help with an illustration. I said I'd share my experience and knowledge. Well, here's some experience. I've shared some knowledge. Here's some experience. I offer hope through this. I awoke on October the 10th, 2004. I was exactly 1 year physically sober, and for the first time that morning I believe I truly surrendered utterly to the day. I turned to God and I accepted whatever life offered to me. It was a Sunday, so I went to my home group where I was setting up at the time. I then went to another meeting, and while there an old timer said he was going to Blackpool. Did I fancy a ride out? We could go to a meeting there that night. I said, oh why, yeah, I'll give that a go. How could I say no, really? So off we went with another friend who came along for the ride too. I sat in the back of the car because apparently she does not sit in the back of a car. Funny. We had a lovely walk on the seafront, had some chips, and then we went to the meeting. They offered the old timer the opportunity to give the main share. He said, no, let Danny, it's his first birthday. This was the first time I had ever fully told my story. It was a powerful and deeply emotional experience, although to be honest with you, I have no idea what I said. I remember how I felt. I can't remember a word that came out of my mouth. After thanks and a bit of cake that had been bought for me, we set off back to Manchester. Again, me sat in the back, because she doesn't sit in the back, she only sits in the front, as she kept saying. Now, I'm not sure exactly what happened, as I'd gone quite quiet in the back, but something happened on that journey back. Apparently we nearly crashed. The two in the front were both panicking and shouting, but me, I was in some other place. I felt this deepening sense of connection right in the core of me. I did not feel alone. I felt held by something, and I felt it right at the core of my being, right in the marrow of my soul, if you like. There was a deepening sense of this kind of a consciousness, a new consciousness, a growing consciousness kind of came over my being. I was not living from self for the very first time in my life. I was not living from the spiritual malady. My roots were beginning to grasp a new soil. They were taking root in this new soil, living from another place. I turned that day, that night, that morning. I made that decision and I took some tentative steps. I began to. Now, a few days later, I formally made the step 3 decision and with the man, and I wrote and shared my inventory steps 4 and 5 right there in his house immediately after doing so. It was an incredible experience the second time around doing this. The words on the paper, they were exactly the same, but my experience of them were completely different. You see, I had the courage now to face up to the truth as to what had caused my trouble in life. I was able to get down to causes and conditions. I truly saw the common manifestations of self, which is of course precisely what we're looking for in step 4, resentment being the number one offender, resentment being the most common manifestation of self. It's no more complicated than that. Don't make it so. You see, no one had ever got to know me, so it was no surprise that I'd always been alone. I saw the truth about my resentments and harm and fear. I saw the truth about my sex conduct, my relationships with people. You know what? Half of my resentments weren't even mine, and I had hurt and damaged the very same people I hated others for hurting and damaging. Those that I saw the truth that those I hated really were no different to me. Afterwards, that night, as I took the crucial hour after sharing my story, it was an incredible experience, a deepening of that sense. I did not feel alone. I did not feel riddled with terror, never mind fear, terror. The world began to look like a different place. Scales of pride and prejudice fell from my eyes, and perhaps, and this had never happened before, the most amazing thing happened. My head just kind of stopped. The thoughts stilled and came to rest with a kind of gentle, tiny little pop. It was almost like a little tiny pop in my mind. The barriers were coming down. I was beginning to experience another state of consciousness. My head has never been the same ever since. That night I slept, probably for the first time in more than 20 years, properly without chemical aid. You know, the insomnia got worse in those, probably the second 6 months of my physical sobriety. I rarely suffer from insomnia now, maybe 2 or 3 times a year at the most, and usually when I'm processing something of intensity or intense grief has happened, something heavy has happened, and I might struggle for one night, but it's only maybe 2 or 3 times in every year. I sleep really well today. As I lay there, it became very clear that I was beginning to become unblocked from the power. As I was beginning to live less from self, I was beginning to overcome the spiritual malady. I could see clearly, it was obvious that I was straightening out mentally. Something was happening. The next day, well, I was ready for 6 and 7. I was willing and I was ready. And I think I was able, certainly capable of seeing the truth. The step 7 prayer is such a powerful tool when fully understood. You know what? It's really a commitment based on the proof that my way has not worked, which the previous steps had proved to me only the day before. I saw it as I lay there for that hour. I just saw the whole truth. It wasn't complicated either. I love this prayer though. Here's the prayer. When ready, we say something like this: My Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. I pray that you now remove from me every single defect of character which stands in the way of my usefulness to you and my fellows. Grant me strength as I go out from here to do your bidding. Amen. And there is the Amen, by the way, not present at the beginning in step 3 when we turn. No, here we make the commitment. It's a different step. We can make a commitment to give ourselves wholly to God, good and bad. Wholly, we give our whole selves. We are committing our whole selves. We're not just handing over our defects or our shortcomings or whatever heck we want to call them. They're the same thing, by the way. They're the same thing as wrongs, or to use religious language, sins. What do you think a shortcoming is? Sin, from sinare, meant to fall short of the mark. That's what a shortcoming is. They're all meaning the same thing. I know there are some people who tell us otherwise, but it's just simply not true what they're telling us. In fact, actually, here's your proof. Just look at the steps on the wall, or the steps that are there on page 59 in the book. On that page, step 7 talks about shortcomings. And yet in the prayer, they're talking about defects of character again. So the words are even used interchangeably in step 7 itself. Stop making this complicated. It doesn't help people. And finally, we're asking for the things to be removed that block us from the usefulness to God and those people around us, those manifestations of self. And that's the commitment we're making to God and the people around us. Instead of living from self, that's where we're living from, and that's where our work is, the people around us. You don't even have to look far, they're there in front of you. The whole program is about turning from a self-serving life to serving God and the people around us. This is the promise and the purpose of recovery. If you think about it, we have recovered and have been given the power to help others. That's the point of it. This is anything but a selfish program. If you think it is, then you don't understand what is meant by selfishness, which is essentially spiritual malady, by the way, or you haven't understood what this is about. To be selfish is to live without any thought or consideration for others, which is the exact opposite of the spiritual programs of spiritual principles of recovery. Recovery is about developing consideration for something other than ourselves. To be selfish is to live without any thought or consideration of others. So please stop saying it's a selfish program. It is anything but. In fact, it's the exact opposite of a selfish program. I moved on to steps 8, 9, 10, 11. I was given the instructions for these steps together. I was shown what to do, and thank God I was shown what to do. I had entered the world of the Spirit, and I wanted to grow in understanding and effectiveness. I hadn't previously, but now I wanted to grow spiritually. That said, I needed to see how self was still manifesting through constantly watching, asking, discussing, making amends and turning to others, which is step 10. And I needed to connect deeper to the solution through prayer and meditation. Yes, I've made the commitment in step 7, but my sphincter did begin to twitch around step 9, I have to say. Oh, by the way, a tight sphincter is usually a really good sign that you're backing self. It really is. If you're uptight there, relax, be open. It's okay, you know, it's okay. We literally we block ourselves off at times. And as anybody who knows anything about meditation will tell you, that good meditation begins with relaxing the sphincter. Relax. Be open. As I continued, the connection deepened. The consciousness of this presence grew as I cleared up the past that had accumulated out of my attempts to live by self-will, which is the spiritual malady. But this malady still had some power. There was still a great deal of fear, but through the practice of 10 and 11 it kept me moving forward, doing the action, when at times I really did not want to do it. I reconnected with so many people over the next few weeks and months who I had rejected, hated and hurt. Some of the experiences were just so deeply and powerfully moving. Gosh, I can just feel them now. Those experiences changed me forever. I've never been the same man since. Not perfect, but I've never been quite the same man. I'm just going to share one example here because it's a powerful one and it illustrates something about this for me anyway. It was also the most terrifying one to do. I contacted my half-sister and asked if she would contact her dad for me so that I could meet him. This was a man I was utterly terrified of and who had ruled us with terror. So I was sat in a living room one day and his car pulled up. I stood up and watched him walk down the path. Well, actually, he kind of hobbled down the path. He was in quite a bad way physically. As he walked up the path, I felt the hate, the fear, the anger, the terror, the pain, the shame. I felt it leave me right there and then, before I even spoke a word and saw his face. Saw him face to face anyway. So I met him at the door, in the kitchen. He kind of walked through the door. I shook his hand and we sat and we talked together. I looked him in the eye and I made my amends. Where I was at fault, where I was wrong. Then he spent most of the rest of the time, I just spent most of the rest of the time listening to him, and he spoke of many things. As I looked at this man, I just saw a sick man, a lost man, a man in a lot of pain, and a man filled with so much regret. You know what? I also felt love for him, in the real sense of the word love. In that space between us, something opened up. God brought healing. The power just came alive there in that space between us. It's something I felt consciously and powerfully and deeply. I felt it so powerfully and deeply, you know what? And I believe he did too. Healing took place there. I left after about an hour, and I just seemed to float through the next few weeks as I continued reconnecting to all life. Something that continued as the months and the years have gone on by now, many years now. I began to live from this power. I was becoming unblocked from this power, bit by bit. I was transcending the spiritual malady. I was being transformed, and therefore I was transcending the malady. I was beginning to feel whole for the first time in my life. I did not feel empty inside. I did not feel wrong. I did not feel there was something fundamentally flawed about my humanity. I felt I belonged here, and the world seemed different too. The world just didn't seem wrong either. I immediately began working with others, and what an experience that has been. I am never more conscious of this loving presence than when I'm working with another man as we engage with this solution. To repeat that favourite promise of mine, the promise and the purpose of recovery, here in a sentence. We have recovered and been given the power to help others. The promise and the purpose of recovery. We have recovered and been given the power to help others. That's why we're given the power to help others. Simple, isn't it, really? My life moved on and the consciousness grew, as it does when we live from this power, when our roots grow from the soil. More was certainly revealed as I grew in understanding and effectiveness of both the problem and the solution. It's not complicated, I find. I think another one of the biggest lies that we believe, and I certainly believe this, is this one. It's a simple program for complicated people. Well, you know what? I don't believe that anymore. While I do believe it's a simple program, it's not an easy program, but it is simple. I no longer believe that we as a people are any more complicated than anybody else. I no longer believe that. My problem, wasn't that I was complex or complicated, although I certainly believed that, and it seemed so as I got lost up my own backside constantly. My problem was selfishness and self-centeredness. My problem was the spiritual malady. And I would do anything to protect that, and it's that created all my problems. When I have problems today, it's usually because of this. It's because I've gone back into self, and as a result I've begun to feel spiritually blocked off and unwell again, and at this point fear emerges again, loneliness settles back in. That's the spiritual malady. And there is a simple solution to this, which it is my task to turn to and thus become unblocked again. My spirit was never actually sick. It's dangerous to think your spirit is sick. I believed it was. It's just I was blocked off from love, and all I had to do was turn back to love, to return to love, if you like. It's what we do. All I had to do was to allow my roots to grip and bed into a different soil, if you like, if you prefer that analogy. And as the result, I began to be set free from the bondage of self. The beautiful thing, of course, is that I didn't need to go find some new soil. The soil was already there within me, as it's within you and everything else. It's within everything. Just got to search for it. It wasn't that complicated. I just got lost in myself. I wasn't even that sensitive, or that's what people said. It's just I took everything personally. I made it about me, even when it wasn't. So I got lost in those emotions. I got stuck in feelings. I didn't live in life. Now, like everybody else, life has not always been a bed of roses since I tapped into this stuff. I have suffered many of the joys and many of the heartaches, including over the last year. I've experienced the blessings and curses of life that you get from choosing life. I've laid before you life, blessings and curses. Choose life. Things have not always gone as planned, but it's the same for everybody, isn't it? We've had to live with this pandemic and the immense changes to our lives and our livelihoods. You know, personally, I know 20 or more people who have died from the virus this last year or so, and everybody's life's been affected by it. There've been many other deaths in this time too, which of course we've not been able to mark as we would normally do. Great deal of suffering and isolation and loneliness, beyond the spiritual kind of loneliness, actually being alone, cut off, often in pain. No doubt everybody has experienced slipping into self at times this last year or so. I have from time to time, but I've continued to turn to the solution and continued to remember the Step 7 commitment to God and to the people around me. I've continued to work tirelessly with others, just as I've done throughout my recovery, rain or shine, feast or famine. I've worked, in the last year or so with as many men as I know. In fact, you know what? I think I've worked with more this last year than I have done at any other time in my recovery. I think I've worked with more. And you know what? I've not had to look. They've just been there. I've just been available. I've had to adapt how I work. I've had to work differently, but I have done so. And you know what? Folk in recovery have always done that. My life is way beyond anything I could ever have even begun to imagine. Unbelievable. I experienced life in a way I didn't know was possible. And that experience deepens and it freshens all the time. So I want to quote a bit here actually from the foreword to the 12 steps and the 12 traditions. Here Bill wrote, AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in nature, which, if practiced as a way of life, can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. This is what it's all about, Recovery from alcoholism is about a life of wholeness and usefulness. The malady is about feeling useless and empty, that life means nothing, that existence is hopeless and meaningless, that you're just caught up in your own stinking little hole, our heads up our smelly bums basically. And it ain't pleasant for us and it ain't pleasant for anybody else, and it just doesn't have to be that way. You can be free in the sunlight of the spirit, not in the dark place. Recovery from alcoholism is about living with purpose. Purpose in this world. It's been made fit for purpose. The commitment we make in step 7 is to God and the people about us. We are aiming for wholeness and usefulness. This is why we ask for the defects of character to be removed that are blocking us from serving God and the people around us. The beginning of that step 7 prayer states, to repeat again, my Creator, I am now willing that you should have all of me, good and bad. We are giving our whole selves in this prayer. We're not just handing over defects. Please don't think about it that way. We're committing to living a different life. We're giving our whole selves to life. And in so doing, we're being changed, we're being transformed, and in so doing, we're transcending the spiritual malady. We're made fit for purpose, if you like. What we're here to be who we really are. Page 70 here, but it says on page 77. Our real purpose is to fit ourselves to be of maximum service to God and the people around us. We get to live the life we were born to live, not merely for the good of our tiny selves though, but for the good of all. We never have to suffer from the spiritual malady. That does not mean that we never suffer from the pain of life. Of course we do. Of course we do. To expect that is to somehow think you're never going to be human. Of course we do. We will lose the people that we love. We will grieve. Things will go wrong. And we will grow from these things. So long as we keep turning toward the solution and we continue to live a life of sane usefulness, so long as we continue to do that, we will be free from the spiritual malady. But we will not be free from the experience of suffering and pain. That's part of life. But we will be free from despair, for we will have meaning in our lives. But we will not have to suffer from the spiritual malady, which is a state of despair, hopelessness, which a state of no hope. That's what despair is. Remember that once the spiritual malady is overcome, we straighten out mentally and physically. But also remember that if the malady takes a hold again, if we slip into those old ways, we get blocked off once again, we play God once again, we subtly try to manage life once again, and those common manifestations of self take over our lives, and we become overcome by resentment, which is the number one offender, the most common manifestation of self, which is the spiritual malady. And we're in serious trouble again. Here's the warning they give us here on page 66. It is plain that a life which includes deep resentment leads only to futility and unhappiness. To the precise extent that we permit these, do we squander the hours that might have been worthwhile. But with the alcoholic, whose hope is the maintenance and growth of a spiritual experience, this business of resentment is infinitely grave. We found that it is fatal, for when harbouring such feelings we shut ourselves off from the sunlight of the spirit, the insanity of alcohol returns, and we drink again. And with us, to drink is to die. But it doesn't have to be like that. The truth is, the solution is simple, and it should get simpler the longer you're on it. There is no advanced class in recovery. It's the same simple solution till the end. It never changes. Emotional sobriety that people talk about comes simply by practicing day by day these principles, by turning to this simple solution and enabling this power to live in and through us. Do you know, if you do, you will know a life beyond anything you could have even begun to imagine. Beyond your greatest imagination. You have no idea what you can tap into. I've no idea what I'm going to tap into next. But I'm willing. I'm going to give it a good go. I'm going to keep on stepping down that road of happy destiny, trudging the road of happy destiny, they say. I'm a happy trudger. So I say to you, keep on rocking in the free world, you groovers and you shakers out there. God bless and stay free. Amen.